Summer 1943. The war in Europe had reached a fever pitch. The Allies had clawed their way across North Africa, driven Rommel into retreat, and now stared north across the Mediterranean, toward the underbelly of Hitler's empire. Yet, deep inside Axis territory, beyond the reach of most Allied bombers, lay the heart of Germany's war machine. Ploiești, Romania. Here, a sprawling maze of refineries and storage tanks supplied nearly 1/3 of the Reich's oil. From these fields came the fuel that powered panzer divisions, Messerschmitt fighters, and the U-boats that prowled the Atlantic. Destroy Ploiești, and the German army might starve for oil, but reaching it meant flying through a sky designed to kill. The target sat 1,200 miles from the nearest Allied base, ringed with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, decoy installations, and even smoke generators that could cloak the entire valley in darkness within minutes. The Germans had nicknamed it Fortress Ploiești. Still, in the summer heat of Libya, a bold plan took shape: Operation Tidal Wave. Narrator, low, steady. To strangle the enemy, the Allies would reach for his throat, and Ploiești was the pulse. The plan was unlike any before it. Instead of high-altitude bombing, the U.S. Army Air Forces would go in low, flying at treetop level to avoid radar. 177 B-24 Liberators from the 8th and 9th Air Forces would rise from airfields near Benghazi, cross the Mediterranean, thread through the Balkans, and strike the refineries from multiple directions. A precision assault delivered by courage and compass alone. The mission's architect, General Louis Brereton, believed surprise was the key, but others called it madness. "They'll never make it out," one officer whispered. The men of the 44th, 93rd, and 389th bomb groups listened, their faces lit by desert starlight, engines humming in the distance. Many wrote letters that night, folded quietly into flight jackets. One gunner scrawled in his diary, "If we come back, it'll be a miracle. If we don't, tell them we tried." At dawn on August 1st, 1943, the desert trembled. Engines of the B-24 Liberator, 4 radial Pratt & Whitney R-1830s, roared in unison, the air vibrating with purpose. Each bomber carried nearly 5,000 pounds of explosives and enough fuel to barely reach Romania and limp home. The crews strapped in, young men in their 20s, faces caked with dust, hearts steady in the rhythm of the propellers. They lifted from the sand in perfect formation, silver wings glinting in the rising sun. Below, ground crews saluted quietly. Above, 177 bombers climbed eastward into the thin blue haze of the Mediterranean sky. Over the sea, radio silence held. The only sound was the deep hum of engines and the hiss of wind through open gun ports. Beneath them stretched endless water. Ahead, the distant shadow of Europe. One mistake in navigation could scatter them across enemy territory. Hours passed. The first mountain peaks of Yugoslavia appeared through morning haze. The air grew colder, thinner. Somewhere to the north, German radar picked up faint echoes, moving fast, low, and many. Narrator hushed. For 7 hours, they flew toward a fortress that knew they were coming, a sky bristling with steel and smoke. Inside the cockpits, pilots tightened their grip on the controls. Gunners scanned the clouds for fighters. Below them, valleys gave way to fields of wheat, villages and rivers that shimmered like glass. They were closing on Ploiești. One navigator looked at his map, then at the endless terrain below, and realized something was wrong. A small navigational error had thrown part of the formation off course. Some bomb groups were now flying toward the wrong city entirely. The plan, precise, synchronized, fragile, was unraveling in the wind. But the mission pressed on. Orders were simple, no turning back. As the bombers descended to low altitude, the landscape changed. Factories, chimneys, and railway lines appeared on the horizon. The men could already smell the faint tang of oil in the air. The gunner in the lead plane turned to his pilot and said, "Well, here's where it gets interesting." The pilot grinned without humor. "Hold tight." They throttled down to treetop level, 150 feet above the ground, flying so low that the wake of their propellers bent wheat fields flat. The engines thundered through the Romanian sky, each beat closer to the most dangerous 10 minutes of their lives. Narrator measured rising intensity. They flew not into history books, but into fire. 177 bombers, chasing the impossible, armed with courage and the last ounces of luck they could carry. The black columns of Ploiești's refineries loomed ahead, vast, dark, and alive. The crews braced as the first flak burst in the distance. The fortress was awake, and the sky, once so quiet, began to burn. Morning light crept across the cockpit glass, turning the world beneath them into a quilt of rivers and fields. The bombers had been airborne for nearly 7 hours. They were exhausted, tense, and far from home, still hundreds of miles from the target. The air inside each B-24 was stifling, thick with oil, sweat, and nerves. Every vibration of the engines pressed into the bones. Every man knew, once they crossed the Carpathians, there would be no turning back. The Liberators droned northward in tight formation, the sky alive with sunlight and noise. Below them stretched the vast green expanse of the Balkans, scattered with villages, farms, and winding roads. On any other day, it might have been beautiful, but today, it was a battlefield waiting to happen. Narrator measured foreboding. They were flying into the mouth of the beast, low, slow, and alone. At 10:00 a.m., the first formations began their descent. They were supposed to approach Ploiești from multiple directions, timing their attacks within minutes of each other. But navigation had gone wrong over the mountains. Clouds had obscured landmarks. One formation had drifted north, another veered south. Radios stayed silent, strict orders. Coordination, the plan's fragile lifeline, began to fray. Inside one bomber, a navigator shouted over the engines, "That's not the river on my map!" The pilot glanced down. The valley below was unfamiliar. Somewhere below them, the Germans were already mobilizing. In the control towers around Ploiești, sirens wailed. German and Romanian gunners swung into position, manning batteries that ringed the refineries like teeth. More than 200 heavy anti-aircraft guns, hundreds of smaller 20mm cannons, and a network of decoy fires and smoke screens stood ready. The defenders had rehearsed this moment for months. A captured German officer would later admit, "We knew they would come. The question was only when." The first B-24s burst from the mountain shadows at barely 150 feet. Their 4 engines thundered across the Romanian countryside, startling farmers in their fields. Church bells clanged in panic. Civilians looked up to see black crosses forming in the sunlight, not on the wings of German planes, but on the smoke from American engines cutting through the morning haze. From the lead aircraft, Colonel Keith Compton, commander of the 376th Bomb Group, scanned the horizon. "There it is," he muttered, the sprawling maze of Ploiești's refineries, glinting with tanks of silver and steel. For a brief moment, the scene looked peaceful, almost still. Then the sky erupted. Flak burst around them in black blossoms. Tracer rounds slashed upward. The bombers flew so low that anti-aircraft shells detonated beneath them, sending shockwaves through the fuselage. One B-24, hit in the wing, cartwheeled into a field and exploded. Another, engines ablaze, held course long enough to release its bombs before plunging into a refinery yard. Narrator, tense, rising. They were flying through fire, past chimneys, smokestacks, and the very flames they'd created. The pilots had to weave between columns of smoke and the skeletal towers of the oil plants, navigating by instinct alone. Machine gun fire rattled through the hulls. Oil tanks erupted like volcanoes, black flames rising hundreds of feet. Crewmen shouted target coordinates, dropped payloads, and prayed they were over the right refinery. At ground level, the noise was apocalyptic. Romanians later said the earth itself seemed to tremble. Engines screaming, bombs thundering, men shouting above the chaos. The air filled with the smell of burning oil, gunpowder, and molten metal. One B-24, nicknamed Sandman, came through the inferno so low that its belly nearly brushed the rooftops. A photograph, later recovered, shows it framed against a tower of fire, a single machine caught between life and death. In another bomber, a co-pilot shouted, "We're hit!" Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. The pilot's hand slipped on the controls, but he held the aircraft steady. "Just get us there," he said through clenched teeth. "That's all we can do." By now, the formations had scattered completely. The sky over Ploiești was a chaos of smoke, explosions, and burning aircraft. Some crews dropped their bombs on secondary targets, storage tanks, rail lines, anything they could reach. Others never made it to the city at all. The mission was unraveling in real time, maps useless, radios silent, gunners firing blindly into the haze. But no one turned back. Narrator, quietly. They were bound not by orders, but by conviction, that if they failed, others would have to try again. For every bomber that broke through, 2 more fell. Fields burned. Rivers ran black with oil. Yet even amid the destruction, something extraordinary was happening, an act of raw, collective will. In one of the final waves, a single B-24, already burning, dove straight toward the Astra Romana refinery. The pilot, mortally wounded, refused to bail out. He leveled the plane and released the bombs just before impact. The explosion shook the ground for miles. That moment, that sacrifice, became the symbol of the mission itself. When the smoke cleared, the skies were littered with falling debris and drifting parachutes. The survivors turned for home, engines coughing, wings shredded, fuel nearly gone. Behind them, Ploiești burned. Ahead lay the long flight back across enemy territory, through storms, flak, and fading light. Narrator, low, reverent. They had struck the monster's heart. Now they had to find their way home, through a sky that had already claimed so many. The smoke from Ploiești rose like a living thing, black, heavy, and curling into the high summer sky. It trailed the bombers as they clawed away from the inferno, struggling for altitude. The crews could still see the flames from miles off, a blazing wound on the horizon. But behind that fire lay wreckage, planes scattered across fields, oil fires raging, and men who would never return. Narrator, low, steady. In the space of an hour, courage had turned the sky to ash. The survivors of the lead waves fought to reform, but the mission had disintegrated into fragments. Navigational errors, smoke, and death had shredded the plan beyond recognition. The air was thick with turbulence from burning air, the smell of oil and cordite filling every cockpit. Communication was almost impossible. Most crews no longer knew who was alive. At treetop height, a single B-24 named Wongo Wongo limped westward, one engine gone, hydraulics failing. Inside, the gunner bled out over his machine gun. The pilot, Major John Jerstad, a veteran who'd already completed his required missions, had volunteered for this raid, knowing it might be his last. Now, with the fuel tanks hit and wings aflame, he ordered his crew to bail out. They refused. "We're staying," one said quietly. "We're with you." Moments later, the plane exploded in midair. Jerstad would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Far below, villagers ran for cover as the sky rained metal. Flaming aircraft streaked across the fields, their engines screaming until the moment of impact. Some crews parachuted out only to be captured immediately by German patrols. Others vanished into the black smoke. Those who survived the first wave were greeted by a new threat. Luftwaffe interceptors, Messerschmitt, Bf-139s, and Focke-Wulf 190s dove from above, hunting crippled bombers as they limped away. Gunners opened fire, spraying the sky with tracers. The air shimmered with exhaust and chaos. One B-24 went down fighting, tail guns still blazing as it disappeared into the forest. Narrator measured. There was no formation now, no command. Only small groups of men flying west, held together by luck, by fear, and by the need to see home again. Over the Balkans, the survivors flew into storms. Rain lashed the shattered fuselages, washing blood and oil from the metal skin. The wind howled through torn panels. Some bombers barely stayed airborne. Others crash-landed in fields or mountainsides, crews crawling from the wreckage before setting the remains aflame to avoid capture. A navigator from the 93rd Bomb Group later recalled, "We couldn't tell where we were, just clouds and thunder. Every direction looked like the end of the world. By the time they crossed the Danube, daylight was fading. The fuel gauges were nearly empty. One by one, the bombers fell silent, their engines sputtering out. Some ditched at sea. Others vanished without a trace. At Benghazi, the ground crews waited through the night. The first aircraft staggered in just after midnight, riddled with holes, wheels barely locking. The men stumbled out in silence. No one cheered. The airfield was lit by the dull glow of burning flares as they counted arrivals, each minute slower than the last. Of 177 planes that had taken off, only 88 returned. Dozens were too damaged to fly again. In the mess halls, empty seats stretched in every direction. For hours, the names of the missing echoed over the radio. 376th, 98th, 44th Bomb Group. No contact. Narrator, hushed, reverent. The mission had struck deep, but it had bled itself dry. At first, headquarters struggled to make sense of the operation. The refineries had been hit hard, storage tanks burned for days, and smoke darkened the Romanian sky. But the German engineers worked fast. Within weeks, Ploiești was running again, damaged but alive. On paper, Operation Tidal Wave had failed. In truth, it had revealed something larger than success or failure. Back in the camps, the survivors spoke little. One mechanic walked among the returned bombers, tracing his hand across the bullet holes and blackened paint. "They did their job," he murmured. So did the men inside. Those who lived remembered the fire. They remembered the smell of burning oil, the roar of engines, the sound of metal screaming as it tore apart. And they remembered the faces of the ones who hadn't come back, the friends who had flown into the storm and never out again. Narrator, soft, almost a whisper. In war, there are victories measured not by ground gained or factories destroyed, but by the courage of those who go where no one should have to. The sun rose again over the desert airfields of Libya, casting long shadows over the silent B-24s. The mission was over, but its echoes would reach far beyond the burning fields of Romania. Dawn broke over Benghazi's desert airfields, pale and quiet, the sunlight glinting off the twisted metal of returning B-24s. The ground crews moved among the survivors, speechless. The bombers that had come back looked like ghosts, fuselages torn, wings pocked with holes, the smell of burnt oil still thick in the air. Some limped in on 3 engines, some on 2. A few belly landed in plumes of dust. Inside, men stumbled out, eyes hollow, faces streaked with oil and sweat. They had flown to hell and back and left friends behind in the flames. Narrator, slow, reflective. Of 177 that took off, fewer than half returned. The mission was over. The legend had begun. News of the raid spread quickly through Allied command. The casualty lists were staggering. 310 men killed, 108 captured, 5 awarded the Medal of Honor, more than in any other air operation of the war. The generals studied reconnaissance photos, tracing the blackened shapes of refineries that still smoked days later. At first glance, the results looked devastating, but by the end of the month, German engineers had repaired much of the damage. The oil flowed again. In London, some called it a tragic failure. In Washington, they called it proof that the men of the air forces would fly through anything to break the enemy's will. But for those who had been there, for the crews of the 44th, 93rd, and 376th bomb groups, success or failure no longer mattered. They had done the impossible, and lived to remember it. Back home, telegrams began to arrive in small towns across America. Mothers opened envelopes with trembling hands. Wives stared at words they couldn't bear to read. For them, Ploiești was a name that would never fade, a word that meant both pride and loss. At the hospitals in Libya and Malta, the wounded spoke in fragments. They talked of oil fires that blotted out the sun, of propellers slicing through smoke, of the roar that never seemed to end. One young navigator, his hands wrapped in bandages, whispered to a nurse, "It wasn't courage, it was duty. We just kept flying." Narrator, measured, compassionate. They had proven something greater than strategy, that conviction can outlast fear, that resolve can endure even in failure. As weeks turned to months, the lessons of Ploiești reshaped Allied air doctrine. The idea of low-level daylight bombing, once seen as daring, was now recognized as suicidal. The U.S. Army Air Forces shifted tactics, high-altitude formations, tight escort by P-51 Mustangs, precision through technology instead of sacrifice. The courage of Tidal Wave's crews had written those lessons in blood. In early 1944, the bombers returned to Romania, this time with long-range escorts, radar guidance, and numerical superiority. By that autumn, the oil fields at Ploiești were truly crippled, and the German war machine began to stall. The dream that had burned so dearly the year before was finally realized. But for the men who had flown that first raid, triumph was always tempered by memory. At reunions years later, veterans spoke softly of that August morning, of the rumble of engines across the desert, the endless flight north, the black smoke curling over the Danube. They carried it with them for decades, like the smell of oil that never left their clothes. A pilot, gray-haired and quiet, once said, "We didn't change the war that day, but we showed what kind of men would fight it." In museums now, a few of those aircraft remain, restored, polished, silent. Children climb inside, touching the worn metal where hands once gripped in terror. Beneath the paint and rivets lies the story of 177 crews who dared the impossible, and in doing so, defined a generation. The camera lingers on the image of a single B-24 silhouette gliding through a clouded sky. The horizon glows faintly, a memory of fire fading into gold. Narrator, final voiceover, solemn and proud. They flew into the heart of the enemy and found the limits of human endurance. They failed to destroy the oil, but they ignited something far greater. The belief that courage itself can alter the course of history. Fade to black. The sound of distant engines hums beneath the credits. Operation Tidal Wave, August 1st, 1943. In memory of the 5-32 airmen who did not return,